There is something important I want to share with you, something that took years of observing avoidant behavior in real-life situations before it finally became clear. Once you recognize this pattern, you begin seeing everything differently. You cannot return to the old way of interpreting their words or actions because suddenly so many confusing moments start making sense. Conversations that once felt inconsistent, emotionally exhausting, or impossible to understand begin to reveal a hidden pattern. It often feels as if you are trying to understand someone whose emotions keep changing shape right in front of you. One of the biggest mistakes people make is believing that avoidant individuals do not love deeply or simply lack strong emotions. That is not the truth. The real difference is not about how much they feel. It is about what they do with those feelings once they appear. People with a secure attachment usually experience emotions in a more direct way. Feelings slowly become clearer, and over time they naturally turn into words, actions, honesty, and emotional closeness. Even when expressing love feels uncomfortable, they still move toward openness. Their inner emotions and outer behavior usually stay connected. With avoidant people, the process often moves in the opposite direction. Their feelings do not stay small. In many cases, they become stronger over time, sometimes much stronger than they expected. Yet instead of expressing those emotions, they try to manage them, hide them, or keep them under control. The deeper the feeling becomes, the harder they work to contain it. Because of that, their expressions of care become indirect and difficult to recognize. Stay with me because what comes next explains why so many people misunderstand avoidant behavior completely. Once you notice this pattern, you may never hear their words in the same way again. Avoidant love rarely arrives through obvious confessions or emotional conversations. It does not usually appear through clear statements or dramatic displays of affection. Instead, it often hides inside everyday conversations, ordinary behavior, or even comments that sound distant, reserved, or slightly critical. If you are searching for love only in the traditional ways people expect to receive it, you may completely overlook what is happening. You may assume they are confused, sending mixed signals, or simply uninterested, when in reality, they are expressing closeness in the safest way they know. Their emotional system tries to protect itself from feeling too exposed, so affection often takes forms that are easy to misunderstand. That is why I want to help translate this hidden language. I am not talking about the rare moments when they openly admit their feelings. Those moments are uncommon. I'm talking about the small everyday behaviors that many people ignore because they seem ordinary or emotionally flat. These quiet moments often carry much more meaning than they appear to. One of the earliest signs that an avoidant person has formed a genuine emotional connection is something that surprises many people. It can look like unnecessary criticism or detailed observation. At first, this seems confusing. Why would someone who cares point out tiny flaws or unusual details? But look deeper. When an avoidant begins noticing the little things about you, not just your obvious qualities, but your personal habits, routines, emotional shifts, and unique behaviors, something meaningful has already changed inside them. They are paying attention in ways they normally reserve only for someone who has become emotionally important. What happens next may surprise you because this attention is rarely accidental. They begin noticing details that almost everyone else misses. They remember the way you hold your coffee without thinking about it. They recognize the difference between your genuine excitement and the smile you wear simply to be polite. They notice how your voice changes depending on whether you feel relaxed, nervous, or completely comfortable. They quietly observe your routines, your reactions, your emotional rhythms, and even the smallest changes in your behavior. Sometimes they point these things out with a tone that feels analytical, overly honest, or even slightly sharp. It can sound like criticism or correction rather than affection. Naturally, this can leave you feeling confused or wondering why they focus on such tiny things. Yet beneath that surface is something very different. This level of attention is not emotional distance. It is a form of closeness that feels safer for them than openly admitting how much they care. By studying your habits so carefully, they are showing that you have become part of their inner world. You are no longer just another person passing through their life. You have become someone they think about regularly, someone they quietly observe, remember, and emotionally keep track of without even realizing how much space you now occupy in their mind. They may never describe it as love, and they may never use the words you hope to hear, but their attention reveals what their voice often cannot. If you've ever wondered why their actions seem to say more than their words, keep watching because the next signs become even more revealing. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, this level of attention never happens by accident. They do not spend mental energy on people who have no emotional importance to them. Their mind does not begin collecting tiny details about someone unless that person has already become meaningful in a deeper way. The confusing part is that this importance rarely turns into obvious affection. Instead, it often appears through comments that seem detached, highly observant, or even a little critical. To the other person, it can feel cold because there is no clear warmth, no emotional confession, and no direct statement of love. It is easy to mistake it for judgment or emotional distance. But underneath, something very different is happening. This is often one of the first signs that genuine attachment has already started growing. For an avoidant person, attention itself becomes a quiet form of closeness. If they remember little things you said weeks ago, notice habits you never realized you had, or point out patterns that almost nobody else sees, you already occupy an important place in their inner world. It may not resemble love in the way most people expect, yet it is closely connected to it beneath the surface. They are watching you with a level of focus that feels almost automatic, a kind of attention that cannot easily be switched off. People rarely keep track of someone who has no emotional value to them. An avoidant who has formed a real bond does not notice you once and move on. They continue noticing you over and over again, often without intending to. Since openly admitting that emotional impact feels overwhelming, those feelings usually appear as observations instead of affection, as thoughtful comments instead of vulnerable words, or as a calm, reserved tone that hides emotions much stronger than it seems. Stay with me, because the next sign explains even more about what is happening beneath the surface. Another phrase you may hear from an avoidant person after they have become emotionally invested is something like, "I'm not very good at this." At first, it sounds like they are lowering expectations or warning you not to expect too much. Many people hear those words and assume the person is already creating distance or preparing to leave before the relationship has a chance to grow. But when you look more closely, especially as the emotional connection becomes stronger, those words often carry a completely different meaning. Hidden underneath is something they may never say directly. "I really want this to work with you, but I'm scared I won't know how." That sentence contains vulnerability, even if the person speaking it does not fully recognize it. They may believe they are simply being honest or realistic, yet they are quietly revealing how much this connection already matters. People do not question whether they are enough for someone they do not care about. That kind of self-doubt appears only when losing the relationship feels possible and emotionally painful. Their fear is not always about rejection. Sometimes it is about disappointing someone who has already become important. What sounds like hesitation is often the opposite. It is evidence that the relationship carries real weight inside them. They may never express that fear through emotional speeches, but it appears in subtle ways that are easy to overlook. What happens next may surprise you, because another common phrase reveals even more than this one does. A third statement you may hear is simply, "You're different." Those words can be spoken in many ways. Sometimes they are filled with quiet admiration. Other times they sound uncertain, almost like they are trying to solve a puzzle they cannot quite understand. In some situations, they may even sound defensive, as though your uniqueness has disrupted something they were trying to keep under control. No matter how it is expressed, those words usually carry real emotional weight. People with an avoidant style often rely on familiar relationship patterns because predictability helps them feel safe. They naturally place people into mental categories based on past experiences and keep a comfortable emotional distance. But every now and then, someone does not fit those familiar patterns. That person cannot be easily explained or placed into an old category. Suddenly, the usual emotional rules stop working. It becomes harder to predict the relationship, harder to remain detached, and harder to ignore what is happening inside. That disruption is rarely meaningless. It often marks the beginning of genuine emotional attachment, even if they have not admitted it to themselves yet. After years of watching these relationship patterns unfold in real life, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Once you understand this hidden emotional language, many conversations that once felt confusing begin to make sense. The misunderstanding has never been that avoidant. People lack deep feelings. In many cases, those emotions run much deeper than they appear. The real difference lies in what happens after those feelings develop. While secure people naturally express what they feel through words, actions, and emotional openness, avoidant individuals often move in the opposite direction, holding those emotions inside instead of letting them be seen. And that hidden process changes everything you thought you understood about the way they love. Even when there is hesitation, uncertainty, or quiet vulnerability, the emotional movement for a secure person still goes outward. Feelings slowly become conversations. Conversations create understanding, and understanding builds closeness. Their inner emotions and outward behavior usually stay connected. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, the same emotional experience follows a very different path. The feelings still grow. Sometimes they appear slowly, sometimes with surprising intensity, and sometimes they develop before the person even realizes what is happening. But instead of flowing toward expression, those emotions are pulled inward. They become controlled, managed, and carefully contained. The stronger the attachment becomes, the more the nervous system tries to protect itself by limiting emotional exposure. As a result, what they truly feel and what they actually show begin moving in different directions. This is why avoidant behavior is misunderstood so often. The emotions are not missing. They simply appear in indirect ways. They surface through subtle actions, quiet contradictions, and ordinary conversations that carry much more emotion than they seem to. If you only expect obvious words of affection or clear emotional confessions, you will miss most of what is really happening. Stay with me, because the next sign explains why many people mistake hidden attachment for emotional distance. One of the earliest clues that an avoidant person has already formed a deep emotional connection is something that surprisingly looks like criticism. At first, that sounds completely backwards. Most people naturally connect criticism with rejection or disapproval, but when you look more closely, a different picture begins to appear. Once an avoidant person starts paying attention to you, that attention becomes incredibly detailed. They notice tiny habits, small facial expressions, slight changes in your tone of voice, the way your behavior shifts depending on how safe or relaxed you feel, and subtle changes in your mood that almost everyone else overlooks. Instead of expressing warmth directly, they often mention these observations in a calm, analytical way. Sometimes it sounds like a thoughtful remark, sometimes like a gentle correction, and sometimes like a question that feels unnecessary or unexpectedly sharp. On the surface, it may not sound affectionate at all. In fact, it can feel like they are evaluating you rather than caring about you. Yet beneath those comments, something much deeper is happening. This is not emotional distance. It is a tension that has become almost impossible for them to switch off. People do not study someone so carefully if that person has no emotional value in their life. The mind does not remember tiny patterns, notice repeated behaviors, or quietly build a detailed picture of someone who means nothing. When an avoidant person reaches this level of awareness, it usually means something important has already changed inside them. They are no longer simply seeing you, they are carrying you in their thoughts on a regular basis. Here is the important part. Because openly admitting emotional closeness feels uncomfortable and risky, they cannot easily express that attention as affection. So the care comes out in another form. Observation replaces confession. Care becomes commentary. Curiosity takes the place of vulnerability. To the person hearing it, those remarks may sound like judgment when, in reality, they are often hidden signs of attachment trying to exist in a way that feels emotionally safer. Another phrase you may hear is, "I'm not very good at this." At first, it sounds like they are warning you not to expect too much or preparing you for disappointment. Many people assume those words are an early attempt to create distance before the relationship grows stronger. But during a genuine emotional connection, the meaning is often far more personal. What they are quietly communicating is something closer to, "I really want to do this right with you, but I'm afraid I don't know how." That fear carries more vulnerability than the words themselves reveal. It is not always fear of commitment. More often, it is fear of failing in a relationship that has become emotionally important. What happens next may surprise you because this quiet insecurity often appears only after real attachment has already begun. People rarely question whether they are enough for someone they do not truly care about. That kind of inner pressure appears only when the relationship already matters. It shows up when losing the connection feels possible, when disappointment feels real, and when the outcome suddenly carries emotional weight. So, what sounds like a simple disclaimer is often evidence of deep investment that still feels too risky to express directly. You do not worry about disappointing someone who means nothing to you. Those worries only appear when your heart has already become involved. Another statement that often reveals hidden attachment is, "You're different." These words can be spoken in many ways. Sometimes they are gentle and filled with quiet curiosity. Sometimes they carry fascination, as though the person is trying to understand something that does not fit their usual expectations. Other times the words sound more cautious or even slightly unsettled, as if your uniqueness has disrupted the emotional system they normally rely on. Whatever the tone, this statement is rarely casual. Avoidant people often depend on familiar patterns because predictability helps them feel emotionally safe. They quickly place people into categories built from past experiences and interact from a comfortable distance. But when someone cannot be placed into those familiar patterns, everything becomes less predictable. They cannot easily explain you, control the emotional experience, or keep the same distance that once felt comfortable. That unexpected difference often marks the beginning of a much deeper emotional connection. They may never call it love, they may never fully understand it themselves, but the moment they begin seeing you as someone who does not fit their usual emotional rules, the relationship has already started changing in ways they cannot easily ignore. If you've ever wondered why their actions seem to tell a different story than their words, the next signs will make that hidden language even clearer. People with an avoidant attachment style usually organize relationships through familiar emotional patterns. Over time, they create internal categories based on past experiences, and those categories help them feel safe because everything becomes more predictable. When someone fits into one of those familiar patterns, they can keep a comfortable emotional distance. They know what to expect, and that sense of certainty allows them to stay in control. But when someone does not fit those expectations, when they act in ways that cannot be easily understood or placed into an existing mental category, the entire system begins to shift. That uncertainty captures their attention, not the passing kind that disappears after a conversation, but the kind that quietly remains, the kind that returns again and again without invitation, the kind that slowly takes up space in their thoughts, even when they are busy with other things. When they tell you, "You're different," they are often revealing much more than they realize. They are admitting that their usual emotional map no longer explains what they are experiencing. You have stopped being just another familiar person and become someone they cannot easily predict or define. Once that happens, emotional attachment becomes harder to ignore. They are no longer relating to you through old habits or familiar expectations. Instead, they are facing a connection that feels less controllable and more emotionally significant than they expected. That quiet disruption is often where real attachment begins to grow, even if they never say it directly. Sometimes they protect you in small, unnoticed ways, without asking for recognition or appreciation. They may never call it love, yet those quiet actions are often the closest expression of love they currently know how to give. Stay with me because this next truth may be the most important part of everything we've discussed. Understanding these hidden expressions of attachment does not mean you are responsible for decoding them forever. Learning this emotional language can be incredibly helpful. It keeps you from assuming that emotional distance always means a lack of feeling. It reminds you that silence is not always emptiness and that restrained emotions can still be genuine. It may even help you trust your own instincts when you sense that something meaningful exists beneath the surface. But there comes a point where constant interpretation stops bringing clarity and starts becoming emotionally draining. Eventually, trying to translate every action, every silence, and every mixed signal becomes far more exhausting than simply receiving honest communication. No matter how meaningful the connection may be, you are still allowed to want a relationship where love does not require endless interpretation. You are allowed to want affection that is spoken openly instead of hidden behind hesitation. You are allowed to want conversations that bring peace instead of constant uncertainty. You deserve emotional consistency that allows your nervous system to relax instead of staying alert, always searching for hidden meaning. People with avoidant patterns can absolutely grow. They can learn to express emotions more openly, become more comfortable with vulnerability, and build healthier relationships. That possibility is real, but it is also a journey they must choose for themselves. You cannot complete that work on their behalf. No amount of patience, understanding, or emotional insight can replace their willingness to face the beliefs that taught them closeness was dangerous and vulnerability was something to avoid. What happens next depends on their willingness to change, not your willingness to keep waiting. Your responsibility is much simpler, yet just as important. It is learning to see the relationship honestly without shrinking your own emotional needs to fit someone else's uncertainty. It means recognizing genuine care when it exists, even if it is expressed quietly. At the same time, it means recognizing when the lack of clarity is costing you more than the relationship is giving back. Indirect expressions of love are not imaginary. In fact, avoidant attachment can carry remarkable emotional depth that stays private, carefully guarded, and rarely spoken aloud. Those feelings can be sincere, lasting, and deeply meaningful, even when they never become obvious. But something being real does not automatically make it healthy or sustainable for you. There is an important difference between understanding another person's emotional world and carrying the burden of translating it forever. One brings wisdom, the other slowly pushes your own emotional needs into the background. If you sensed love in the quiet moments, in the subtle attention, in the thoughtful gestures, in the conversations that almost became vulnerable but stopped just short, your instincts were not necessarily wrong. Those moments often reflected something real. They revealed emotional closeness, expressed in the safest way that person knew at the time. but you are never required to remain in a relationship where love exists only through hints, fragments, and unfinished conversations. Eventually, love is not only about recognizing what someone feels for you, it is also about being able to receive that love clearly, openly, and without constantly wondering what it means. Whether you choose to stay and grow together or step away in search of a relationship built on greater openness, that decision is not a failure. It is simply an honest response to what you need in order to feel emotionally safe, respected, and secure. Above all, remember this: you are not imagining everything. The depth behind the distance was often real. The emotions beneath the silence were often genuine. The connection may have been complicated, guarded, and difficult to express, but it still mattered. And at the very same time, you have every right to want a love that does not depend on hidden signals or constant interpretation. You deserve a relationship where care is not only deeply felt, but also clearly shown, where understanding comes naturally instead of requiring endless decoding, and where love reaches you without needing to be translated.